Scary story. Welcome to the world of scary stories. This is going to be really creepy. If you want to hear exclusive stories that definitely won't be here, be sure to visit my second channel, Madam Nightmare. I'll leave the link under the video. So, are you ready? Let's go. My grandma was always a little weird. She was prepared for anything. A week before everything fell apart, she called and said, "Grandson, come over. It's going to be like 63 here soon." I laughed at the time, but I went, anyway, just to be there. My head was in complete chaos, and her voice sounded so calm, so confident, as if she'd been waiting for this her whole life. I arrived at her house on the outskirts of town, when the news was already showing how everything was going to hell. The streets were in complete chaos, screams, sirens, and then there was silence. An old wooden house with a leaning fence, but it looked like a fortress. The windows were boarded up. The door was heavy, metal, like in a bunker. When I knocked, she opened the door as if nothing had happened. Without even asking how I got there, she simply said, "Welcome home, grandson. Come in. Everything is ready." Inside, everything was just as I expected, as if she had been preparing for the end of the world her entire life. The walls were filled to the ceiling with canned goods, cereal, and bottles of water. The walls of the rooms were lined with canisters of gasoline. There was an entire arsenal in the pantry, guns, knives, and some homemade traps. Everything was perfect, and it scared me. "Granny, how did you do all this?" I asked, feeling a chill run down my spine. "I was preparing," she answered simply. For the next few days we lived in this fucking silence. Sirens and screams outside the windows. But inside, peace. I tried to talk to her, to understand how she knew, but she was silent, just sitting in a chair, and staring into space, stroking her old cat. One night I couldn't sleep. The screams outside were too loud, so I went into the kitchen to get a drink of water, and saw that Grandma was awake too. She was sitting by the window, peering into the darkness, and whispering something. I came closer. She turned to me. "Grandson, don't be afraid," she said. "That's not the worst part." Her words made me cringe. I didn't understand what could be more terrible than all this chaos. The next morning I decided I needed to do something. Just sit within four walls and wait. That wasn't my thing. I started sorting through things in the pantry, to keep myself busy. I moved cans, checked cartridges, and suddenly, behind one of the drawers, I came across an old wooden chest. It was locked, but the lock was old, and I picked it easily. Inside were old newspapers, some photographs, and a thick leather diary. I opened it. It was written in my grandmother's small, scrawled handwriting. I started reading it. October 16, 1963. It started today. The same symptoms, the same smell, panic and screams in the city. I huddled in the house. My son, my little Vaneksha, sits quietly. He doesn't understand what's happening. I hope he never understands. We will stay here and wait. As always. I turned the page. The next entry was 24 years later, March 23, 1987. They're back. I thought it was the last time. The newspaper entries talk about an unknown virus. But I know, it's them. I closed all the windows and boarded up the doors. Screams are heard at night. They beat on the walls. I saw him. This is my Vaneksha, my beloved son. But he doesn't recognize me. His eyes are empty. I have to be strong. I have to hold on. I need to feed them so they go away. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't believe my eyes. My father, who passed away when I was little. He's a zombie. This can't be. I read on. September 14, 2002. The third time. I'm old, but I'm strong. I know what to do. They can't get inside. They remember me. I hear their voices. They're calling for me. Calling for their mother. I feed them like last time. It's the only way. Otherwise they'll tear the whole house apart. I need to keep them downstairs. In the dark, I threw the diary aside. My hands were shaking. 3 times she'd survived the zombie outbreak. She'd watched her son, my father, become one, and she'd kept him in this house. I couldn't understand. I had to talk to her. I went out into the kitchen. She was sitting in the same chair as always, but now I looked at her with different eyes. "Granny, what is this?" I put the diary on the table. She looked up at me. "Did you find it?" she said. "I knew you would, and I left it there on purpose." I couldn't say anything. I just looked at her, waiting for an answer. "I couldn't tell you," she continued. "I didn't want to scare you, but you have to know. It's not just a virus. They remember. They're looking for those they loved. They're looking for their home, and they'll never leave until you feed them." "Will you feed me?" I repeated, feeling the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. "Who? What?" She remained silent. I woke up in the middle of the night from a strange sound, like someone scratching on wood. I tensed up and quietly went out into the hallway. The sound was coming from the basement. I looked at Granny. She was sitting in the cross. I quietly approached the basement door. It was locked with a heavy steel bolt. I looked at Granny. She nodded to me. Go, she said. But, be careful. I slid the bolt aside. The door creaked open. Something smelled from inside. I turned on the flashlight on my phone and began to go down. With every step the smell grew stronger. I went down the last step and shone the light around. I saw them. Dozens of disfigured, rotting bodies. They stood, leaning against the walls, piled on top of each other. Their eyes were empty, but they moved slowly, like in slow motion. They weren't aggressive. They just stood there and looked at me. Their bodies were covered in sores, rot. I recognized them. I recognized the old neighbor who had passed away 20 years ago. I recognized the mailman who brought letters as a child. And I saw my father. He was standing against the wall and looking at me. He looked just like in the old photographs, just his flesh, and I screamed. I couldn't believe my eyes. I shone the light on the floor. It was strewn with food. There were scraps of meat in the corner. I understood. She was feeding them her own zombie army, her family, and they were all looking at me, the last member of this strange, terrible family. I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around. Granny was standing in the doorway. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking at them. Time to feed the basement again, Granny said, and I realized I'd never be able to get out of here. I'd become part of this house, part of her collection. Basically, forget everything you knew about hospitals. What I ended up in was something else entirely. It started out banal. I needed a routine blood test for a medical examination at work. I googled a private clinic with good reviews so I could avoid waiting in line. I found one, seemingly decent, in an old but solid building, almost in the city center. The name was something like Health Plus or Med Techspert. I can't remember anymore. I drove up and parked. From the outside, everything looked normal. A massive wooden door. I pushed it open and walked inside. And then something strange started happening. You know, that feeling when you walk into a room and it's like the sound has been turned off. Not just silence, but a vacuum. My ears started ringing. In a regular clinic there's always background noise. Coughing, someone shuffling their feet, people grumbling at the reception desk, the phone ringing. But here, nothing. Absolute silence. I found myself in a spacious hallway. The floor was old tile. The walls painted a government-issued pale green. It smelled of bleach, medicine, and something like cheese. Like an old basement. There was no reception at all. Just an empty counter in the corner, littered with some papers. No computers. No phones. Not a soul. Maybe I'd gone to the wrong place. That was my first thought. But there was a sign on the door with the opening hours. I was on time. I walked further into the long corridor. The fluorescent lights under the ceiling hummed and flickered. But they gave off little light. And there they sat. The patients. About 10, maybe 12. Sitting on hard wooden benches. Men and women of various ages. All in ordinary street clothes. And everyone was silent. Not just silent, but as if frozen. No one was scrolling through their phones, reading a book, or looking around. They were all staring straight ahead, at the opposite wall. I walked past, trying not to make any noise, and sat down on an empty bench at the very end of the corridor, facing them. I felt incredibly uneasy. It was as if I'd landed on a film set, where extras were waiting for the director's command. I took out my phone to distinguish myself. There was no network, no Wi-Fi. Okay, that happens. I put the phone away and waited. I didn't know who to wait for. The doors of the offices along the corridor were closed. There were no signs or numbers on them, just smooth wooden doors. 5 minutes passed. Nothing changed. No one entered. No one left. None of the people sitting there even moved. And then I noticed. At first, I didn't understand what exactly it was about their appearance that had me so uneasy. Well, people were sitting there, silently, maybe waiting for some complicated procedure, nervous. But then my gaze caught on the hands of one woman. She was sitting closest to me. Her hands were resting on her lap, and her fingers were trembling very finely. It was an unusual tic, like that of old people. The tremor was ragged, unnatural, as if the fingers had a life of their own. I looked at the others, and a chill ran down my spine. Everyone, sitting in that damned hallway, had the same trembling hands. The young guy in the hoodie, the older man in the coat, that woman, all had the same tiny convulsive tremor. It was impossible. They sat in different positions, but their hands were all the same. And then I heard a sound. It came from the back of the hallway, from somewhere around the corner. At first, it was quiet, barely audible, dull and damp. It was as if someone had dropped something heavy and soft on a wet tile floor, something that didn't bounce. The rhythm was almost perfect, like a metronome, but sometimes it would falter, as if whoever was making the sound had lost strength for a second, then resumed with fury. Thump, thump, thump. I gripped the bench. I looked at these people with shaking hands, listened to this disgusting wet thump, and realized I was in the wrong place. It was too late to run. The patients didn't react to the sound at all. Their empty eyes continued to stare at the wall. This made it even more frightening. The knocking grew louder. It was getting closer. Now I could make out new details. After each knock there was a soft slap and something like dragging on the floor. Like someone taking a step and dragging a foot behind them. I stopped breathing. I looked at the turn at the end of the corridor where the sound was coming from. A dark opening beyond which I could see nothing. I should have run. I should have screamed. But I just sat and watched. And then it appeared. A figure appeared from around the turn. It was a man in a white coat. He was tall, thin. He moved slowly, patting one leg. The same gait I had heard. He stopped at the end of the corridor, and looked at the sitting patients. Then his gaze found me, and he smiled. God, that smile. It expressed nothing, just thin lips stretched to the side on a face as pale as a sheet. But the scariest thing was his eyes. His eyes were absolutely empty. They had no pupils, no irises, just two whitish spheres that seemed to peer through. It was then that I realized I was making that knocking sound. He held a stethoscope in his hand, but it was an unusual one. Instead of a metal membrane, a heavy lead ball was strapped to the end, wrapped in something like dirty bandage, and with each step, he methodically hit this ball on his chest, right over his heart. He walked slowly toward me. His empty eyes never left me. The smile never left his face. The patients around him still sat motionless, but their trembling seemed to intensify. It became almost convulsive. He came up and stopped right in front of me. He smelled like spoiled meat. He didn't say a word, simply raised his free hand, bent his index finger, inviting me to follow him back into the darkness of the corridor from which he had come. His movements were smooth, and I looked at his empty eyes, at that eerie smile, at the stethoscope with the weight he was beating on his chest. I realized that if I went with him, I would never return. No, I whispered. I abruptly jumped up from the bench, pushing him away. He didn't expect it and staggered, making a quiet, thumping sound. I ran towards the exit, towards the same massive door through which I had entered. I didn't look back. I just ran, hearing that measured knock behind me. There it was, the door, salvation. And before I grabbed it, I made the biggest mistake of my life. I finally turned around, and he was standing there, looking at me. His smile grew wider, but that wasn't what was scary. Everyone sitting on the benches, they were standing. They stood in the aisle, a dense, silent wall. They were no longer looking at the wall. They all looked at me, and their hands no longer trembled. They hung calmly at their sides. He walked slowly toward me, and ahead stood a wall of empty people, blocking my exit. I looked at them, and they looked at me. He was approaching from behind. The door was a few steps away, and I don't know what's more frightening, what's behind me, or what awaits ahead.